Imagine a world where the holiest ground on earth often carried the heaviest scent of human waste. In the 1st century, the path to the temple was not just a spiritual journey, but a constant physical negotiation with filth. As you walk through the narrow stone alleys of Galilee, the heat of the midday sun bakes the dust into the pores of your skin. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, drying clay, and the unmistakable pungent odor of local latrines. We often picture the life of Jesus through a sanitized lens of white robes and pristine landscapes. But the reality was a visceral and often uncomfortable struggle to maintain human dignity without a single drop of running water. If you want to uncover the raw and unpolished reality of the biblical world, then subscribe to this channel now. By joining us, you will see how the most humble moments of life reveal the deepest truths of the gospel. A woman steps out of her home at the first light of dawn carrying a covered clay vessel with purpose. This was not a jar for water or grain, but a container for the waste of a household that had shared a single room through the night. While the Roman elites in Jerusalem enjoyed the luxury of flowing fountains and private drains, the average peasant lived in a world of subsistence. For them, every act of cleaning was a calculated decision that required hours of labor. Water was a precious currency that was carried by hand from distant wells and springs. In a climate where the rain only fell in seasons, a few gallons had to suffice for an entire family to drink, cook, and wash. This physical scarcity was governed by a complex system of religious purity laws. For the Jewish people, the management of bodily functions was not just about health, but about their standing before God. Every morning trip to the edge of the village was a reminder of the barrier between the clean and the unclean. It was into this world of rigid boundaries and physical struggle that Jesus of Nazareth spoke his most revolutionary words. To understand why Jesus would later shock the religious leaders with his views on washing, we must first enter the private spaces of the ancient home. We must see the physical reality of the houses, the courtyards, and the hidden corners where life actually happened. Imagine the villages of Galilee where the architecture itself was a barrier to privacy. Families lived in small dwellings made of basalt stone and mud brick, often sharing a single room that served as a bedroom, a kitchen, and a stable. While the Roman governors built grand aqueducts to carry water to their marble baths, the average Jewish family lived far from such technology. For them, every drop was a treasure that had to be physically hauled up from a valley or a distant spring. Think about the weight of a full water jar on the shoulder of a young girl. This was not a quick chore, but a grueling daily marathon that dictated the rhythm of the entire household. Because water was so difficult to obtain, it was used with a precision that we can barely imagine today. A family might survive on just 5 gallons a day for everything from drinking and cooking to the most basic hygiene. This scarcity meant that washing was rarely a full-body experience. Instead, it was a strategic process of cleaning the face and hands, often using nothing more than a small bowl and a damp rag. When the sun set over the hills, the challenge of the night began. For those living in the crowded rooms of a village, attending to the needs of the body required a discreet use of pottery jars kept in a dark corner. In the morning, these vessels were carried to the edge of the town to be emptied. This task was a fundamental part of maintaining the health and holiness of the community, ensuring that waste stayed far from where bread was baked. The Torah actually provided a specific manual for this part of life. It instructed the people to keep a digging tool as part of their gear, so they could bury their waste in the earth outside their camp. This was not just ancient health advice, it was a religious command. For the Jewish people, keeping the camp clean was a way of honoring the presence of God who walked among them. However, the Roman occupiers had very different ideas about what it meant to be public or private. They brought a style of sanitation that would soon create a massive cultural collision in the streets of Jerusalem. In the grand cities like Sepphoris and Jerusalem, the Romans introduced a concept that was utterly alien to the local population. They built public latrines that were marvels of engineering, featuring long stone benches with holes carved into the rock. Below these seats, a constant stream of water flowed through deep channels to carry waste away from the city. To a Roman, this was a symbol of civilization and health. To an observant Jew, it was a place of deep spiritual and social anxiety. These facilities were communal. meaning people sat side by side without a single partition for privacy. It was a place where business was discussed and gossip was exchanged while people attended to their most private needs. This casual exposure was a direct violation of the Jewish value of modesty. Perhaps the most jarring detail for a modern visitor would be the absence of anything resembling toilet paper. Instead, the Romans provided a communal sea sponge attached to a wooden handle kept in a bucket of vinegar or salt water. Every person in the latrine would use the same sponge, a practice that we now know was a recipe for spreading disease. For the poor, even this questionable luxury was out of reach. They relied on what they could find in the fields or the dusty streets. Most common people carried smooth pebbles or small fragments of broken pottery to serve this basic purpose. Archaeology has even uncovered these discarded pieces known as pessoi in ancient waste pits. This harsh reality created a strict social code that dictated every human interaction. The left hand was reserved exclusively for hygiene, while the right hand was used for eating, greeting, and sacred tasks. To use the wrong hand was not just a mistake, it was a social catastrophe. This separation of the hands was a practical necessity in a world without soap. It was a way for a community to protect itself from the invisible threats that lived in the dirt and the waste. Even without knowing about bacteria, they understood the power of contamination. This is why the act of ritual hand-washing was so central to the Jewish home. It was a bridge between the messy reality of the body and the holy act of eating. A small jar of water was kept at the entrance of every house to ensure this boundary was never crossed. But what happens when these practical rules of health become rigid weapons of judgment? We are moving toward a moment when Jesus would challenge the very leaders who enforced these laws. He would suggest that the greatest filth was not on the hands, but hidden deep within the human heart. In the villages where Jesus spent most of his life, home was a place of extreme intimacy. Several generations of one family might sleep together on a single elevated platform of stone and mud. At night, the only light came from a single flickering oil lamp that barely pushed back the heavy Judean shadows. These houses did not have a single room dedicated to what we would call a bathroom. Every square inch of the dwelling was used for survival, from grinding grain to repairing nets. Privacy was not a physical room you could enter, but a social curtain of silence that everyone agreed to maintain. During the day, the central courtyard became the primary station for washing and hygiene. Here, a large stone jar often held the water supply for the entire day. This vessel was the most important object in the home, but its contents were always limited by the strength of the women who carried it. Imagine the difficulty of a cold winter night when the rains turned the village paths into a thick sludge of mud. Leaving the warmth of the house was not an option. In these moments, families relied on the wide-mouthed clay jars kept in the darkest corner of the room. These chamber pots were a humble reality that every person understood from childhood. They were not hidden away in shame, but managed with a quiet discipline that kept the living space bearable. In the morning, the task of emptying them became a routine part of the dawn. The person carrying the pot would walk toward the village perimeter, where the land began to drop away into the valley. Here, the community maintained designated pits that were carefully placed downwind from the homes. This was a place where the physical reality of life met the open air. These community latrines were often just simple openings in the earth, surrounded by low walls of loose stone. There was no flowing water to carry the waste away. Instead, the sun and the soil were the only agents of disposal. To help manage the overwhelming odors and the swarm of insects, people would scatter handfuls of ash from their cooking fires into the pits. Others might use crushed lime if they could afford it. This was a constant battle to keep the village healthy and free from the plagues that often haunted ancient cities. For the women, these trips to the edge of the village were particularly complex. They had to navigate the requirements of modesty while performing one of the most public and necessary chores of the day. Their schedules were often timed to ensure they could complete these tasks with dignity and safety. This physical grind was the backdrop for the spiritual world of the 1st century. While the religious elite debated the finer points of ritual purity, the common people were simply trying to stay clean enough to survive. Jesus watched these daily struggles and began to prepare a message that would address the true source of human corruption. In the ancient world, your trade was something people could smell before they ever saw you. For the fishermen who followed Jesus, the scent of salt and drying fish scales was a permanent layer on their skin. This aroma would cling to their hair and their heavy wool garments, marking them as men of the water in every house they entered. Even more isolated were the tanners, the men who turned raw animal hides into leather. Because they worked with urine and other pungent chemicals, their workshops were legally required to be situated far away from the city walls. They lived in a state of perpetual physical and social exile, existing on the margins where the air was always thick with the scent of decay. Shepherds faced a different kind of challenge as they spent weeks in the wilderness with their flocks. Without access to a steady supply of water or the ritual baths of the village, they lived in a condition of constant grime. This physical state led many to view them with suspicion as men who existed outside the boundaries of clean society. When Jesus and his disciples set out on their ministry, they became part of this world of constant movement. They walked for miles across the rocky paths of Galilee, their skin baking under the unrelenting Judean sun. There were no rest stops with running water, only the dust of the road that settled into every crease of their bodies. Imagine the physical exhaustion of a day spent on the trail in open leather sandals. Your feet would not only be covered in fine grit, but also contaminated by the waste of passing animals. By the time the group arrived at a destination, the need for refreshment was not just a luxury, but an urgent necessity for health and dignity. This is why the basin of water at the door was the most important gesture of welcome in the 1st century. To offer a guest a place to wash their feet was a profound act of kindness that recognized their shared humanity. It was a humble task that bridged the gap between the harsh reality of the road and the safety of the home. At the heart of this world was a growing tension between two very different ideas of what it meant to be clean. For the religious leaders of the day, purity was a matter of strict adherence to the traditions of the elders. They believed that every meal had to be preceded by an elaborate and specific ritual of hand washing. This practice was not about removing dirt in the way we think of hygiene today. It was a ceremonial act designed to remove any spiritual impurity that might have been picked up in the market or on the street. It required a specific amount of water to be poured over the fingers in a precise sequence of movements. But for the average laborer struggling to find enough water to drink, these rituals felt like an impossible burden. It was a system that seemed to favor the wealthy who lived near the springs while judging those who worked in the dirt of the fields. A storm was brewing over these stone jars of water. Jesus was about to take a stand that would shock his hosts and redefine the very concept of holiness. He saw how the obsession with outward washing could hide a deep and rotting corruption within the soul. We are now entering the moment where the physical world of hygiene becomes a battlefield for the heart. Imagine a dinner party where the atmosphere suddenly turns cold because of a single missing gesture. A religious leader watches Jesus closely, waiting for him to perform the required ritual, pour over his hands. When Jesus sits down and begins to eat without it, the shock in the room is palpable. Jesus does not offer an apology. Instead, he speaks a truth that hits his host like a bucket of ice water. He observes that many are experts at cleaning the outside of the cup and the dish, while the inside is left to rot with greed. This was not a random choice of words. In a land where water was a precious treasure, every household knew the labor of scrubbing a greasy pot with nothing but ash and a few splashes of liquid. To clean only the outside was a foolish waste of effort that left the vessel useless for food. The crowds gathered to hear him explain that what goes into a person cannot make them spiritually unclean. He was speaking in a world where people were terrified of touching the wrong thing or using the wrong hand. He shifted their eyes from the dirt on their skin to the hidden motives in their hearts. We see this most clearly in how he treated the outcasts of society. A man with a severe skin disease was a walking symbol of impurity, forced to shout a warning to anyone who came near. When Jesus reached out and touched him, he broke every social rule of hygiene to prove that his grace was not afraid of infection. Think of the paralyzed man lying by the pool of Bethesda for nearly 40 years. In a city without modern care, those who could not walk were often the most neglected in terms of basic hygiene. By healing him, Jesus restored his ability to maintain his own dignity and join the community once again. When Jesus sent his disciples into the villages, he gave them a striking instruction. He told them to shake the dust of unreceptive towns from their feet. In a world where urban dust was mixed with the waste of animals and men, this was a vivid gesture of leaving the filth behind. He once mocked the leaders for straining a tiny gnat from their wine while swallowing an entire camel. This was a direct reference to the daily chore of filtering drinking water to avoid insects and debris. He was pointing out the absurdity of focusing on small rituals while ignoring massive moral failings. For a culture obsessed with where they relieved themselves and how they washed their hands, Jesus offered a radical new focus. He claimed that the kingdom of God was not found in external regulations or perfect plumbing. It was an internal reality that lived within the heart of every person. Jesus did not come to abolish the need for cleanliness, but to reveal its true meaning. He lived fully in the grit and the heat of the first century, sharing the same physical needs as every other human being. He proved that the divine is not found in a sterile vacuum, but in the very center of our messy and embodied lives. The promise of water that never fails was not a poetic dream for a woman holding a heavy jar under a burning sky. It was a direct response to the physical exhaustion of her life. When we see the weight of the clay on her shoulder, we understand why the words of the teacher felt like a revolution. We live in an age where the struggle for cleanliness is hidden behind chrome and tile, but for the people of 30 AD, purity was an active and visible war against the elements. It was a life lived between the relentless dust of the earth and the high hope of the heavens. By looking at the reality of the Roman latrine and the lack of soap, we see a savior who did not stand apart from the mess of human life. He breathed the same smoke and walked the same dirt as the poorest laborer. His presence proves that the divine is not a fragile thing that requires a sanitized world to exist. He entered the very center of the filth to show that God is not repelled by our physical limits. The absence of a shower did not stop the light of the world from reaching into the darkest corners of the village. This is the grounded truth of the incarnation that we often lose in our modern sanctuaries. The bathrooms of ancient Palestine remind us that human dignity is not found in the luxury of our surroundings. Even without soft paper or flowing water, the people of the first century found ways to honor the body as a sacred space. They used the little they had to maintain a rhythm of respect for themselves and their neighbors. In our own time of endless convenience, we must ask what we have lost by becoming so clean. We have sanitized our environment, but perhaps we have also moved away from the raw and vulnerable reality of being human. The ancient world reminds us that we are creatures made of dust who are still capable of reflecting the light of God. When you read the ancient texts, now try to hear the sound of water hitting a stone basin. Feel the grit of the Judean trail beneath your feet. Remember that the message of grace was first spoken to people who were tired, thirsty, and physically worn down by the world. This journey shows us that the sacred is often hidden in the most mundane details of our daily existence. A small oil lamp, a scrap of wool, or a handful of herbs can all become windows into the heart of the Creator. Nothing in this physical world is too small or too dirty to be used for a higher meaning. If this look at the physical reality of history has changed how you see the world of the Bible, please share your thoughts below. We invite you to like this video and subscribe to this channel as we continue to rebuild the ancient world. Your support allows us to bring the history of the scriptures to life for a new generation. As you walk through your own clean world today, take a moment to appreciate the simple gift of water from a tap. Remember the men and women of the past who carried that same gift in jars of clay. And know that the same living water they found is still available to every thirsty soul in our modern age.